Wow. Thank you so much, Gene. Your talk was amazing, and its depth has given us all a great deal to think about. I have to admit that I'd never thought about the tremendous number of psychic phenomena, or even about the number of universal laws that implies. So I have pages of notes. So in addition to things to think about, you've given us a great deal to discuss, and we're grateful to have an opportunity to ask you questions. Kevin asked, stated, the depth of this disclosure is extremely uplifting. Could you please elucidate your understanding of what force or property limits so many from access to this larger world?
Sure. Well, first, let me say again, it's great being here. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a wonderful experience so far. Last night, forget about what I saw with myself, but just being here, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the conference as well. I guess the short version on that answer would be what one of the Mahatmas said in the Mahatma letters concerning the skandas. And they said simply that the skandas are the limiting factors of the ego. And so really, if we follow the teaching, it appears that our true nature is universal. And yet, from the point of view of our ignorance, which then generates the awakening of what they call in that 12-line nindana process, the samskaras, they tend to limit and form both consciousness as we typically understand it, and the vehicles that are subsequently made that we use. And in that formation, then, as we move down the line of nindanas, there's the ignorance, there's samskaras, there's the formation of consciousness, there's the limitation of name and form. And then planes, I just interject, because we all get put on one or the other planes according to our affinities, and then senses. And it's the perceptual power of universality that gets limited through those senses and through those forms. And so when we look at how those limiting factors contract consciousness, our universal consciousness, and our universal nature, in fact, then we can see, based on our afflictions, if we use Patanjali's term, because once we establish ourselves as an I, a me, a my, then it's mine and not yours. I like you, I don't like you. I like this, I don't like that. And before we know it, we're wrapped up in that karmic whirlpool. And unless we learn how to alter that equation, we are stuck. And it's those skandas then, and the way they function, the nature of their properties, the forces that are inherent within them, that literally limit what we can see, know, and understand.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful. So the next question is, what are some practical ways to tell if one is picking up the lower planes or those of the higher planes? And in addition to that, how would one set up shields of protection if unaware of sudden insight or from these higher or lower levels?
Okay, higher and lower, again, short version. If it's universal, altruistic, and impersonal, you can begin to trust it. And if it's the other, then obviously there are motives that are tied into that. I mean, we have to think that everything that we do is driven by motive, morals, ethics, and virtuous actions, or the opposite, lack of morals, ethics, and virtues. And so whenever there is an I involved in the equation, there tends to be something psychic lurking, and the motive tends to be more for self than other. And so if we're keeping tabs and we are honest with ourselves and we can say, this is I'm acting for the benefit of my family, I'm acting for the benefit of my community, etc., we can still not take personal the results of the actions. In other words, we're not looking for the fruits of those, but we're doing the best that we can. And then in that state of mind, we still have to really critique whatever influences or inspirations occur. And they can always be tested against that background of universality and impersonality.
That's very helpful. And so if there is a great deal of, just adding on to that second part of the question, so if there is that component that is very difficult to separate from, of the maybe a little bit more selfish, a little less universal, if we're picking up on that, do you have any thoughts about how to protect ourselves or how to shield ourselves from that?
Protect, shield. Again, one thing that HPB said that tends to be, I guess, at the heart of all of this individual's thinking is that if our conscience is clear, then we can move ahead. That is, again, conscience, clarity, universality, and impersonality to the greatest degree that we can. I mean, we're not perfect. And one of the meditational, I guess, analyses that helps us in that, we have to remember that even the idea of personality is an aggregate of skandas. So if we are literally taking that apart every day, if we are vigilant and watching what's acting as opposed to who assumes they are acting, because it is the what that's more impersonal and that sees the situation in a way that personality typically doesn't. And that what is more related, we would hope, to that universal aspect of ourselves, whereas the personality limits and says, cause and effect, what's going to happen if I do this? And so again, even in my personal life, I tend to put aside protection, because if I'm protecting myself, I'm protecting my I. And I have to trust karma, because karma is intimate with my being. Karma is the natural expression of what I am more so than who I am. And so I've got to go with that. And if there's a feeling that comes up that says, don't go there, don't do that, then I can reflect. But typically I am not going to be looking, especially if I'm dealing with, what I consider to be occult or whatever, all of the dressings, all of the rituals and everything like that. Again, because of what the Mahatmas once said, that, the idea of rites, ceremonies, and rituals is another aspect of that whole skandic personality. And so if I personally am trying to short circuit that process, I just negate it all. Whatever happens, happens. It's got to be in the line of karma. I can look clearly. I can make the best choice. And if I've made that best choice with the fullness of my being, then I've got to accept the consequences. They just go together.
I love that perspective, the fullness of your being. Yeah. And that once again highlights the importance of self-awareness and self-introspection.
Yes. Yes.
But your comments actually lead perfectly into the next question, which is, you mentioned at the beginning, quote, the understanding of one's own karma and the karma of others. So that understanding.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about that, especially the danger of judging others, as well as an intuitional understanding of the karma of self and others?
Again, I always take it back to the afflictions in Patanjali's ignorance, which is based on non-recognition of what we really are. Then the idea of I, and then everything that follows from that. So if I'm looking at karma, again, nothing to judge, nothing to like, nothing to dislike, but everything to understand in another. And so, for instance, even if I'm, let's say, at work in that mental field of psychiatry and medicine and neurology, and I think of each being simply as one of the analogies here as a sun. And its rays going out, animating the body that it happens to be in, including the brain. It's a victim. And it's a victim of its own karma in terms of the skandic limitations. And so if I can begin to see that and understand that instead of judge that, then I can begin to possibly work the combination lock of those skandas in a different way. Nothing to like, nothing to dislike, nothing to say is good, nothing to say is bad. Simply, this is where we are. Where do you want to be? And what modifications can we make to help you get there? And so that way I try to, leave out of the equation any ideas of I or personality, unless that's something that comes particularly to the forefront and something that someone would like to engage.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes.
A question that has come in is, when I hear the word skanda, I think of samskara. Can you distinguish between these two terms, please?
Okay. For, again, myself and the way that I've come to understand, samskaras are timeless. Skandas form in time and space. The teachings in Patanjali talks about that field or karma shaya, that field of accumulated karma. I think in the Indian traditions, it's samchiti, all of the accumulated karma that we have. And then there's the accumulated karma that we have for a particular life. And so when we are, when I guess we are talking about these samskaras, if they are in that totally timeless accumulated field, they exist there, as Patanjali and Judge say in his renditions and some of the others, as deposits of the force of desire, or tanha. Tanha is the energy in them that is eternal. The skandas, again, come once we go, let's just say, for explanatory purposes, from the plane of the spiritual ego and pure ray. Once we make that transition into the astral light, the highest astral light or the etheric light, whatever we want to call it, that's where the skandas take form. And so it's the forces that exist, just like when we're looking at the unfolding of the universe. The karmic forces for that universe, HBB places in the forces that exist prior to, and I know we can't talk about prior or what comes first, what comes second, but prior to the formation that those forces cause in substance. And it's the formations that become the skandas. Because remember, the skandas then come together to generate a form on those inner planes. Think of the skandas as the archetypal plane, and then their precipitating energies as the creative plane, and then their formative possibilities making the form that will be the awakening forces of the DNA to create the physical form. And so the skandas will vary, they will be put together, they will come apart. These samskaric forces are existing in a state of manifestation that is totally different than those four lower planes of being. So that's how I make that distinction for myself.
Thank you so much. You know, one of the things I love is that the more we talk, the more questions we have. So this is a little bit aside from the previous questions. So could you talk a little bit about the interplay between psychic abilities and potential psychosis with your background as a psychiatrist and a neurologist? Mm-hmm. You know, what are really abilities, natural abilities versus those that are perhaps diagnosed by many?
Okay, diagnoses versus clear abilities. Just think of the analogy sometimes that I use for myself, radio stations, TV stations. If you can tune in, you can get clear reception, you can understand what's coming along, then it's an ability. You tune in, you tune out, you turn on, you turn off. If by some chance you're stuck between stations and you're getting a lot of scatter, you're getting a lot of noise, it's not that you don't have the abilities, but you can't control those abilities. And so if it's causing you more distress in your life, then you've got to find a way to recalibrate the tunings. And in some ways, cognitive work can help you do that in terms of building up your own ability to be flexible within your own mind, to check, to experiment, to control, and to gain inner self-mastery. Or sometimes it's so scattered that you need medications to close the doors, to keep out too much of the excess. I mean, remember, the brain, I think they say, is like 90% inhibitory. It inhibits most of the sensory information coming in, because if it didn't, we would be overwhelmed. And you can also think of that without being prepared for those universal experiences that can shatter your world. If you're not used to universality and it just permeates your being, you're lost. As opposed to a gradual development. So if we're looking at Patanjali, it's going from gross to subtle to very subtle to possibly causal to pre-causal to forces being set up. So if we're doing that trend in our meditation, when we encounter that universality, in addition to having turned off I-ness. Remember, I-ness is that narrow channel that limits it to me. I can't handle universality. That's like short-circuiting my brain. And so the only way that we can really embrace that universality to a meaningful degree is by getting rid of or turning down the volume on I-ness so that our boundaries become fluid without getting lost. And so for those in treatment or in conversation that can control the influences, that they can look at those influences, they can talk about them objectively. If we're subsumed in them, we're consumed, we're obsessed, we're possessed, because the perceiver is the deepest subjectivity that looks out on everything else. And if it's looking out on everything else and gets caught up in it, it forgets that it's the perceiver. So even in our meditation, as we're trying to really attune ourselves to these inner states, the depth of that observing witness is so deep that it doesn't get caught up in everything that it sees. And so therefore it can from within begin to organize even what appears to be chaotic. The other piece that I try to keep in mind with individuals is that there's the vertical, which is what we've been talking about, and then there's the horizontal. The horizontal is everything that's happened to you in your life that is now chaotic and overwhelming, that breaks down the typical boundaries between segments of behavior, awareness, emotions, and affects, and so overwhelms you and doesn't even allow for linear understanding, but it just chaotically consumes you, that becomes psychotic. And usually you'll realize that the psychotic material, similar to the material in dementia, that comes out is about the life. When we're getting ideas that come through that have to do with spurts of universal law. Who was that? The Beautiful Mind movie? I think that Crow played in. There were spurts of real insight in the midst of the chaos. And you can get them both. And so as a physician, it's important to understand that. It's also important to understand death and transition. Because many times when we're called for consult, so to speak, because someone is psychotic and they're ill, the docs just say, hey, make it go away. But really, when you listen to them, they're crossing the dimensions. They're talking about their family members that have died. They're waiting for them. That's not psychotic. That's preparatory. And so then you treat them differently because now you got to help them prepare for the transition as opposed to dealing with supposedly psychotic ideas. So again, there are several realms within that realm when we're talking about spiritual experiences that just intrude and can cause a little bit of havoc, but still they can be regained in terms of stability and then integrated in one's life, versus just psychotic stuff that's totally out of whack that has to do with traumas and abuse and just, parents that have been overbearing or bullying or whatever. And then those that are on that threshold for transitioning either to the states of death and dying, or even just transitioning while they're still okay, but sick. Because sometimes sickness opens up those doorways as well.
Wow. Your patients are truly very fortunate to have you as their doctor.
It depends on which ones you talk to.
It's just a pretty phenomenal. Thank you for that. Sure. I appreciate it. We really probably don't even have time for one more question. We're going to do one more. And so I apologize to all of you who are not going to have your questions answered. Hang on to those and bring them to the discussion group so they can be discussed. Mm-hmm. But this is a little bit aside from the third object, but your perspective that some people say that the evolutionary narratives in the secret doctrine should be considered myth rather than taken literally. What is your kind of perspective on that?
The evolutionary narratives, again, myth depends on where you're at. Myth at one time is thought for a particular race. But then when we look at the evolutionary races, at least from where I stand, we have to understand what the nature of the formation of Manas was that then integrated the information that their sensories instruments gave them. And then we have to recognize also that we were on different subplanes of one plane. So now we've got perceptions that are different. We've got energies and forces that are different. We've got senses that are coming together in a different way than they function today. And so the perception was different. And therefore, the integration of the information was different. And so what was mythical to us is science and realistic to them, because that is, as HPB says, both I think in the SD and in the occult arts versus the occult sciences, a natural state of development for the ego. And again, if we think back to the Mahatma letters where they talk about manas incarnating, the forms developing, and the degree to which manas was awakened in terms of its interactions with the environment, that will give us a basis not to believe that it is just, imaginary or whatever, but to understand that the instrument was different, the forces, and that's why we spoke about the different planes. With their different properties, with their different substances, with their different manifestations, you're going to get different information flow. And so if we're doing this now, let's just say, for instance, in our meditations, we've really gotten to the point where, for those that have read The Elixir of Life, where we're able to make those transitions. If we encounter those astral waves, as the teachers say in the Mahatma letters, we still now have to learn how to interpret them correctly. And therein lies the rub. And we can see this even in life, because you can see something and I can see something. We can both clap, but now ask me what my interpretation of what I experienced was, and ask you. And mine may just sound really wacky compared to yours. And so you're going to say, okay, he's psychotic. And so when we're looking at any interpretations, we've got to really understand and put ourselves in the place of, and understand the entire sphere or world that that person is in before we make the judgment as a definitive yes, a definitive no, a definitive crazy or whatever. Because even if we shift back to the other question, the psychotic individual, they don't believe they're psychotic. They're interpreting experiences to the best of their ability, and that is their reality. And HPB says something similar in that regards as well.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. I just
Thank you.
sit here in amazement. I am so grateful to you for sharing your time, your energy, your perspectives, and your wisdom with us. It is phenomenal.
Well, thank you. And just to say, it's all from the teachings. So, I just happen to be sitting here.
I agree wholeheartedly. We take these teachings and we do our best with them, and they're so deep, obviously, and so many ways to perceive. So, but thank you. I'm sure all of us will continue to contemplate these ideas for quite some time to come. So, with tremendous gratitude to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. Bye-bye.
Bye.